I'm a I'm Seth Erickson. I'm a research data librarian at Penn State, research data librarian for social sciences at Penn State. And I'm also the product owner for ScholarSphere. So we've been working on a new version of ScholarSphere for the last couple of years. Let me share my screen because I have slides I'm supposed to be showing you right now. There we go. Probably makes more sense. The ScholarSphere team involves a sort of development, policy, and curation work. I'm not going to go into this. If people want to talk more about sort of the broad range of work that goes into it, we can. But I want to acknowledge the contributions of all these folks before we go any further. So we've been working on a new version of ScholarSphere over the last year. To give some context, ScholarSphere is one of Penn State's institutional repositories. It's the main one, really, developed in the libraries, by the libraries. As institutional repositories go, its focus is really on open access scholarship. It's a self-deposit repository, which means that anyone with a Penn State Access ID can upload work. And that really is an important consideration that separates ScholarSphere from other kinds of institutional repositories, because a lot of the metadata is coming from users initially, which then curators in the libraries will clean up and augment. It's also content agnostic. So this includes preprints, data sets, presentations, instructional materials, really anything that the Penn State community of teachers and researchers might want to share openly. It was initially launched in 2012, so it's kind of one of the first OAIRs, I believe. And there are currently around 8,000 works in ScholarSphere, although this number kind of has, you need to take this with a grain of salt, because there is this kind of like problem of collections versus works and how you count things. Sometimes people deposit things as collections that should have been deposited as single works. We can talk more about that later. If you want to go to the site, there's the URL. So here is a simple page for a work, which I'll show later. I want to focus a little bit on sort of ScholarSphere 3, which was the old version of our platform, and the problems we were having with it, and sort of what motivated the development of ScholarSphere 4.0. The main thing was that it was really difficult to maintain, and it was hampered by the fact that some of the platform's dependencies, mainly Fedora, were kind of, we were having a hard time updating it. And I think this is an area where Adam can probably talk to some of the specific details of like why the dependencies were sort of gridlocked in the technical aspects of that issue. But basically we were having problems with maintenance. Like we couldn't fix simple things because of some of the dependency problems. We were also really having problems with performance and scalability around large data sets that researchers increasingly want to upload to ScholarSphere. Another thing that we wanted to focus on was integration with other library systems. So at Penn State, we're really working on promoting open access publishing. And we have a new open access policy that really requires researchers to upload open access versions of their publications. And to do that, we need to kind of, ScholarSphere needs to fit in with a variety of other systems that the libraries maintains. And ScholarSphere 3 wasn't really equipped for that sort of integration. So we wanted to build out some APIs that would support that sort of interoperability. And then some other things here to mention are that ScholarSphere is kind of old. 3.0 had been around for a while. And there were some features that we wanted to add that are now kind of common in repositories like Dryad and Zenodo, other open access repositories for scholarship, and we wanted to implement some of these sort of more modern features, specifically around versioning. That's kind of the main thing that we focused on. And then there were some new policies that we wanted to improve. So ScholarSphere 4, we have an updated software stack, which I'll I have a slide about right after this one. We have some cloud native approaches in terms to make the application more scalable. We're working with, we're implementing APIs for integration. And then we have this versioning system, which I'll demo, and a new policy framework. So here's our software stack. We're trying to, again, Adam can go into some of the details here more, but basically we're moving towards as generic as possible of a software stack. The Ruby on Rails framework, we're using the really general purpose tools, not specialized too much. And that's for the purposes of making the platform more maintainable. So it's easier to kind of onboard developers and that sort of thing. I'll move on, but that's our stack. So one of the things that we really focused on was the deposit UI process, which I'll go into. Here's a slide that's showing our new user interface for through which folks can deposit their work. And I'll demo this later. So here's a slide that's kind of going into the details of the versioning system that we have. Basically, the unit of content in ScholarSphere is the work. And we have defined a work as a series of versions. So a work begins as a draft version, and then you can publish that draft version and potentially withdraw that draft version. And each of these states that a version can be in kind of affects the visibility and downloading and searchability of the work. So basically, you can have a work is a series of versions. It's a linear series of versions, and you can only have one draft version at a time. And then the sort of authoritative version of a work is the most recently published version. Hopefully that's not too confusing. I'll demo this later. But this is probably the most complicated part of the application that we're still kind of working on how to present these sets of abstractions and patterns sort of effectively to users, I think. And so with the versioning, we can get nice sort of diffing across the versions of the work, so you can see kind of what's changed from version to version. And then I'm not sure how interesting this is to this community, but we have some new policies related to sort of minimum preservation time frame and sort of deposit sizes and that sort of thing. If you have questions about this, about the policy aspects of it, we can talk about it later. And so those are really the slides I wanted to show. Now I'll just go into the demo itself, or if I can navigate Zoom effectively. 1 second. And Adam, feel free to add anything that you feel like I need to. So
it's good.
So here's the page, the main website. I'm going to focus on the kind of the work management process. So you log in, you can create a new work through this interface. I've got a sample work that I've created for the purpose of this demo here. Sample work. As you can see there, it's in a draft state. There's one version of it that's in a draft state. This is, you can see preview the work here, and then go back to edit your draft. You know, I can update things here. Yeah. Add keywords. Yeah, and then some other metadata here. There's a search interface for adding users and, other contributors to the work. What we're doing here that I would want to point out is, you know, nobody. If somebody doesn't exist, you can add them. And we are requiring an ORCID for new contributors here. So if you want to add somebody who doesn't exist in the database, they need to have an ORCID. So we're trying that out as a constraint. I feel like we'll see how it goes, but that's what we're trying right now. And then there is the file upload stage. Here we're uploading things directly to Amazon. That's a sort of a scalability issue. And then there is a review and publish phase where you set a license for the deposit, set some basic visibility, and then agree to the deposit agreement. And now I'm going to have to unpublish this later. But basically, that's the process that we have. And now I can go in and create a new version of this thing. The new version is immediately created. And it's a draft version, basically. So now I can change this to version 2. And then publish this. And then we have the second version showing the changes, basically, like there. Other than that, okay, so I guess I would also want to say we have the versioning system that happens here, and then there are kind of work level features that we can set through the work settings page. Here we can change sort of, there is a notion in ScholarSphere of Penn State only access, which means that anybody can, basically you need to be logged in with a Penn State Access ID in order to download the files associated with the work. This is also where you would do things like set embargoes and assign DOIs, and then change who can edit the work here. So this is a pretty important page, really, where some of the decisions that we made in ScholarSphere 4 were related to kind of things like embargoes, like when you have an embargo, is the work still searchable? Is it still indexed? Can you access, like, where does the sort of, at what level of the work does the embargo apply? And the choice we made is that the metadata is basically always public. The embargo applies to the ability to download the file. And that's really what I wanted to show here, unless there are other things that folks would like me to demo.
This looks great, Seth. Thanks for sharing. A question about versioning. Do you also have like file versioning, or it's all covered under work versioning?
Right. So each new version is basically a bundle of metadata and files. So if you wanted to change a file in a work, you would create a new version and then upload a new version of the file. That's how that would work. But it's not doing the kind of like Git might do. You might think about sort of the way that some versioning systems like Git will show you differences in the files. Within the files, it's not doing that. It's going to be just like the file itself has changed, right? So does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. Yeah, so even if I want to just add a new file, it would be a new work version.
Right, exactly. So yeah. I would go into, I've already created a draft here. And I guess I published it. So I would upload, and I could remove this file and then add a new one, basically.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that helps things. And is the browse files only on the local hard drive, or is it also any of the network or Google Drives?
Yeah, currently we don't have integration with the cloud service providers right now. It is just the local disk.
Okay, thanks.
I'd like to ask a question about the ORCID stuff. Did you consider the Orchid OAuth workflow for at least the submitting author, if there is one?
I'm not an expert on the Orchid OAuth workflow. I guess what you mean is, could you log in with your Orchid ID to create this, to create a work? Is that what you mean?
Well, yeah, the general idea is that, you know, entering the 16 digits of an Orchid is an error-prone thing. So
yes.
If you want the one of the person who's actually doing something, getting them to log in and then perhaps pre-filling the name is a good way to do things and have an assured verified Orchid.
Right, that does make sense, and that I think that would be that would make sense as a next step. I think for sure that's something that we would consider, I believe.
Yeah, and you know, there's also the possibility, even for the non-submitting author, if you put the Orchid box first, and if someone filled in an Orchid, you could then pre-fill the name box rather than the other way around, and that would sort of provide a check. I've not actually seen that one implemented before because I don't know why, but that's kind of an interesting way of thinking about it. But
no, there's a bunch of features we want to do with Orchids. One thing in particular is that Orchids are now going to be integrated with Penn State, so you can go to your Penn State account and create an Orchid that way. But yeah, like what you were saying about, like, ideally we'd want to say, oh, you have an Orchid, just give us your Orchid and make that like seamless as possible, and then we pull in their metadata. But this was really just like the first hurdle, because we wanted to find a way of really getting our creator metadata under control. And that's the reason for the Orchid requirement. But we didn't really have the hours to make that nice, essentially.
at least having authors with identifiers is a big step in the repository.
Right. Yeah.
Well,
that's like, it's like, okay, so we can now like disambiguate all of the John Does, right? But it's not the best user experience, and we acknowledge that. Yeah.
And have you thought about maybe the next step is pushing metadata from ScholarSphere into Orchid for when people deposit publications or data sets?
Yeah, I think that's going to happen with, and maybe Dan can speak to that, is there's a whole, there's another integration point that we're dealing with our, what we call our metadata researcher database. That sounds kind of like what, there's a, in other words, things get open access stuff gets funneled into our researcher metadata database and then goes into ScholarSphere. So I think it would essentially be coming from Orchid eventually to ScholarSphere instead of the other way around.
Okay.
But I could be wrong. Dan, does that sound right?
We from the researcher metadata database, we can push publication citation information into Orchid. We have the integration with the OAuth flow into Orchid and everything at that point. And we are kind of querying a bunch of different bibliographic information there and open access button and things like that. So it would, there's some workflow there to potentially be worked out, but at this point it goes from a different source into Orchid.
And is that other source a system that you developed or a license thing or something else?
It's something we developed, yeah.
Oh, cool.
I have a quick question. So the initial depositor has to have an Orchid in order to make a deposit?
No, so the initial depositor needs to have a Penn State access ID. So they need to be able to log in with their Penn State account. Okay. And really what the validation is, any author that you add to a work as you're depositing it, either needs to have a Penn State access ID. We could also accept a Penn State access ID as a unique identifier. So if it's a colleague in Penn State, you would just put in their email address or something. If they don't have that, if it's a colleague outside of Penn State, you would need their Orchid ID. And so what this means effectively, because we're dealing with users, who have other things to do, they will, I imagine in many instances, they will just not add the contributors that really we would want to have. I think that's going to be a problem that we're going to need to address.
Yeah, the Orchid restriction is actually only at the UI level. So the database will allow you to add a contributor without an Orchid or a Penn State ID if you need to. We actually had to have that because when we were migrating, we had tons of contributors that had neither a Penn State ID nor a ORCID. So that ability is still there, but again, it was really moving forward. We want to be able to properly identify the contributors that are getting added to works.
Seth, I have a question. I was having some audio issues at the beginning, so you might have touched on this, but on the software stack slide, you don't have Fedora listed. Are you guys not using Fedora in ScholarSphere?
No, we're not. And we were having, I think that was a quite deliberate choice to not use Fedora. We were having, it was a source of pain, I believe, for us that Adam can elaborate in more detail. Because I've been at Penn State, I've been in this role at Penn State for a year now. And so I'm kind of new to this a little bit. And so I don't have some of the experience that Adam has with Fedora, but that seemed like an important move for us.
Yeah, I think the principal reason was that we couldn't do what we needed to do. And that's because I think ultimately we're using Fedora in a way that it shouldn't be used. Fedora is great for more preservation stuff and for more data that's maybe not as fast moving in the sense that it's not changing a lot. So we elected, and also we couldn't scale it. Like in a Kubernetes, we're in this Kubernetes environment, which if you don't know about that, that's fine. It's basically, you have containers of your application and you just deploy more containers to scale out. So you're scaling horizontally with more instances of your application. And you couldn't effectively do that with our version of, we were on Fedora 4.7, I think at the time, and we couldn't do that with Fedora. So the move, and because we had also lost 2 developers, Carolyn and Mike both left. So it was effectively me. And when you're trying to hire new developers, you just want to say, we just need a Ruby on Rails developer and bring them in, toss them in the group and give them some tickets and away they go working, if you're using industry standard stuff. So that was kind of the 2 major reasons. We needed scalability and we needed speed in the sense that we could hire developers and not have to get them accustomed to a completely new stack.
So Adam, this is Robin.
Yeah.
I know someone has asked to put up that software stack slide again. Are you guys using Hyrax or any of the other Samvera components?
We're not. And we initially came, Fedora 3, or sorry, ScholarSphere 3 was running Sophia, the last version of Sophia, which had been deprecated. So we were at a point where we either needed to move to Hyrax or we needed to migrate. And we made the decision to migrate because moving to Hyrax really wasn't, I guess at that time, Hyrax 1 was just out. There was the discussions about Valkyrie and all of these other things that were still in the mix at the time. So we kind of had to make a decision right then and there. And based on that, we decided that migrating out of the Samvera Hyrax stack was the best approach. But you'll notice that we retained a lot of the features. Like you'll see, like there's embargoes, there's permissions. The general data model is still basically the same, although we don't have file sets. There's something like a file set, but it's not presented to the user.
Yeah, I guess I'm just looking at, besides Blacklight, everything else is basically sourced in-house.
Yes, and we chose things that were, again, like what you would commonly find elsewhere, like Postgres, S3 integrations, pretty common. I think the only really new thing we looked at was Kubernetes, but that part was coming from another area of our DevOps development in our IT institution or organization, like as a whole, that we're trying to move to this method of deployment for not only ScholarSphere, but the rest of our applications.
Thank you.
Sure.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to present and for your questions. It's nice to meet you all and to be introduced to this community. I will stop my screen share now.
Yeah, and I'll just note that if anybody has any questions, you can email me. I know a lot of you already from previous Samvera stuff, but I'll toss my email in here, in the chat. And Hopefully when this horrible pandemic is over and we can see each other face to face, I will give a presentation or a lightning talk about this or something, and there can be more discussion. Hopefully that will be soon.